It's been 23 years since I stood beneath that impossible canopy, and sometimes late at night when the house is too quiet, I can still hear the wind shearing through the ancient growth above the tree line. That sound is a memory, yes, but it's also a warning. A constant low-frequency hum that reminds me the human concept of time is a fragile, petty thing when measured against the true chronology of the wilderness. What I found wasn't just evidence of a creature, it was a historical record, a timeline etched into wood that obliterated every textbook, every geological marker, every expectation we hold about life on this planet. It revealed a legacy so vast, so staggeringly enduring, that knowing it fractured my perception of reality. And frankly, my own lifespan felt utterly meaningless afterward. I saw proof of an intelligence that watched oceans rise and forests fall, an intelligence that measured its existence not in decades, but in epochs. The sheer, shocking longevity recorded there is something that should have remained buried. I should have turned back the moment I saw the first sign of deliberate manipulation, but curiosity is a heavy chain, and sometimes the forest wraps it around your throat until you're forced to see what shouldn't be seen. Before we begin, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I was 42 that summer, a Forest Service veteran, a relic really, working the deep cuts of the Olympic National Forest in Washington State. My name is irrelevant now. What matters is the occupation. I was a loner by necessity and preference, assigned to the rugged, seldom patrolled perimeter bordering the restricted research zones. My territory was a mosaic of dense cedar stands, glacial melt rivers, and unforgiving high-altitude meadows. It was a place where the air tasted of wet rock and old decay, where the sun filtered down in green, watery shafts, and where the silence was often so profound it became a sound in itself, a ringing pressure in the eardrums. I had come to the woods to escape the noise. That's the truth of most rangers, I suspect. We carry burdens that are too heavy for civilized places, and the sheer immensity of the forest offers a kind of temporary absolution. For me, that burden was a marriage that dissolved into resentment, leaving me with a residue of guilt thicker than the morning fog. Sarah used to say I loved the trees more than I loved her. She wasn't entirely wrong. The trees didn't ask questions. They just stood. They demanded respect, but they never demanded explanation. My routine was mechanical, almost monastic. Wake before dawn in the cramped, damp confines of the ranger cabin, a glorified shed miles from the nearest paved road. Coffee that tasted like river mud, instant oatmeal, and then hours spent traversing the ridgelines, checking remote cameras that rarely captured anything more exciting than elk, repairing ancient boundary markers, searching for illegal burn pits or forgotten traps. My boots knew the terrain better than my eyes did. I was tough, skeptical, and intimately familiar with every legitimate threat the wilderness presented. Cougars, bears, rapid hypothermia, and the slow, insidious loneliness that gnaws at the edges of the mind. I prided myself on that realism. I was the guy who debunked the tourist sightings, who patiently explained that the strange howl was a coyote pack, and the large print was almost certainly a very big, flat-footed grizzly. Bigfoot was a joke, a folklore curiosity used to sell t-shirts at the general store 50 miles away. It was a story told by folks who hadn't spent enough time in the real cold, the real dark, the place where true fear lives, which is always internal. That summer, though, the routine began to fray. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, in late July. The season had been unusually dry, the kind of dry where the ground screams under your tread. I was patrolling the upper drainage of the Klickitat tributary, an area known for old-growth Douglas firs, monsters that stood 200 feet tall and had survived centuries of forest fire and logging attempts. This region was particularly remote. I hadn't seen another human footprint there in months. The first sign wasn't visual, it was olfactory. I remember stopping dead in my tracks, my senses immediately on alert. I was drinking water, tilting my head back when a wave of air hit me. It wasn't the smell of decay. I know rot, I know death, I know sulfur springs. This was different. It was a musky, ammoniac odor, overpowering and utterly foreign to the ecosystem, but beneath the acrid punch there was something else. A sweet, almost sickeningly potent smell, like old sweat mixed with fermented fruit and wet, dirty fur. It was the scent of something immensely powerful and extremely unhealthy. It instantly dried my mouth. My rational mind tried to place it. A huge bear den, maybe a sick animal. But my primal brain, the one wired into 40 years of living outdoors, screamed, wrong. I stood there for a full minute, stock still, backpack straps digging into my shoulders, listening to the rushing of my own blood in my ears. The forest was too quiet, not just quiet, but hushed. Normally, even in the deepest wilderness, there is noise, the rustle of voles, the hum of insects, the distant chatter of jays. Here, there was only the wind above the canopy and the slow, deliberate drip of dew from the needles. Every bird, every small mammal, every insect had vanished or frozen solid. It was the silence of a held breath, the kind of stillness that occurs just before a predator strikes. My knees felt suddenly brittle. My hand went automatically to the flare pistol holstered at my hip, a useless gesture against something unknown. I felt exposed, huge and clumsy. I was an intruder where I usually felt like a native. I pushed deeper, moving slowly off the game trail, drawn toward the source of the musk, which seemed to emanate from a dense stand of young hemlock. I reasoned that if it was a bear, I needed to haze it out of the area before hikers, however rare, blundered into it. As I approached the hemlocks, the ground beneath the trees became strangely disturbed, not torn up like a pig rooting, but smoothed over, depressed. It looked like something heavy had rested there for a long time. Then I noticed the structural disturbance. About 50 feet ahead, a series of young saplings, fir and alder, maybe 6 inches in diameter, had been snapped clean off, perhaps 8 to 10 feet above the ground. They weren't broken by a falling limb or splintered by wind. They were twisted and folded, the wood fibers ripped horizontally, cleanly and deliberately. This was beyond the casual destruction of a foraging grizzly. This required leverage, massive strength, and, crucially, intent. A massive, invisible hand had simply decided these saplings needed to be cleared. My breath hitched. I found myself hyperventilating shallowly, the cold dread starting to pool in my stomach. I knelt beside one of the broken trees, running my fingers over the ragged tear. The raw wood was slightly sticky with sap. The break was too high for a normal human, even me, and too clean for a bear. A bear would chew or swipe. This was the work of pure power applied with brutal efficiency. I looked up, scanning the canopy, feeling the familiar, horrifying sensation of being watched. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct, honed over decades. I wasn't just in the forest anymore. I was in its space, and it knew I was there. The scent was overwhelming now, almost causing nausea. I forced myself to stand, to keep moving toward the center of the disturbance, my eyes darting between the mossy floor and the dense underbrush. My mind was scrambling, trying to fit this evidence into a known category, but every category felt like a lie. Then, through a thicket of rhododendron, I saw it. It wasn't a structure or a den. It was a single, impossibly large tree, a western red cedar, scarred by centuries, its base wider than my truck, and it was covered in marks. The tree stood alone, a sentinel in a small clearing where the ground was strangely flat and bare of needles, almost like an intentional plaza. The air here felt cooler, heavier, almost sacred, and the scent was fiercest right there. The bark of this ancient cedar, thick and deeply furrowed, had been modified. Not carved like human graffiti, but indented, scraped, and worn away, forming vertical lines and clustered markings that climbed the trunk far higher than any man could reach without specialized equipment. This wasn't random clawing. This was organized. This was deliberate. This was a record. I approached slowly, heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The marks started low, about 5 feet up, and climbed relentlessly, some reaching 15 or even 20 feet off the ground, etched into the tough outer bark. They were deeply ingrained, suggesting incredible force applied over vast stretches of time. At first, I thought they were territorial markers, scent posts or rubbing spots. But as I moved closer, circling the immense trunk, I realized the structure of the marks defied simple animal behavior. They weren't random scratches. They were aligned in vertical groupings, and within each grouping there were horizontal scores, seemingly measuring relative height. And the arrangement wasn't chaotic. It was chronological. Some markings were faint, rounded by years of weather, almost filled in by new bark growth. Others were raw, jagged, clearly recent, and the heights they marked were staggering, far exceeding the reach of any creature I knew. I stopped at the base of the tree, looking up, squinting against the watery sunlight filtering down. My training, my logic, my entire adult life screamed, "Turn back. Leave this place untouched." But the markings were a silent promise of forbidden knowledge. They were a library, and I was illiterate, yet determined to read. I pulled out my camera and started photographing the tree meticulously, section by section, starting with the lowest, oldest marks. As I worked, the full, shocking implication of what I was looking at began to dawn on me, chilling me far more effectively than the mountain air. If these were, as they appeared to be, growth markers, a way of measuring the progress or height of individuals, then the sheer depth of the older marks and the incredible number of distinct groupings that faded back into the history of the tree itself suggested a continuous presence, a continuous lineage. This wasn't just a spot where a bear scratched an itch. This was a legacy. Generations of something colossal had been coming back to this exact spot, for God only knows how long, leaving their physical history written on the trunk of an ancient, silent witness. And as I ran my hand over a set of very old, deeply scarred horizontal lines that indicated a being standing perhaps 9.5 feet tall, marking itself at that height, a paralyzing thought struck me. An insight born of terror and sudden clarity. If this creature, whatever it was intelligent enough to measure its own growth and record it, then the sheer number of overlapping records meant they weren't living for a mere 40 or 50 years. The tree held the secret to a terrifying, unbelievable truth about their lifespan, a truth that would immediately invalidate human history. I felt a dizziness wash over me, the sensation of standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into a chasm of lost time. The air seemed to vibrate with the presence of something vast, ancient, and still nearby. The true terror was not that they existed, but that they had existed here, in this spot, monitoring themselves, for longer than the written history of man. I stood there, tape measure already slipping from the holster on my belt, the afternoon sun turning the clearing into a cathedral of dust and diffused light. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of pine needle decomposition and something else. A dry, musky sweetness that felt organic and ancient, like the smell of a forgotten tomb or deeply aged cedar. This was no ordinary tree. It was a western red cedar, a sentinel, perhaps 8 feet wide at the base, its bark deeply ridged and fissured, a monument that had weathered centuries of coastal storms and mountain snows. But the bark wasn't what held me. It was the scarring, the sheer, staggering height of the scores. I walked the circumference of the tree slowly, breathing shallowly, trying to force my adrenaline back down into a professional, Ranger Patrol rhythm, but my hands were already shaking and the knot in my gut was cinching tighter. I had been called out for strange activity, a string of inexplicable deer kills, clean snaps to the cervical vertebrae, nothing like a bear or a cat. But this transcended mere predation. This was evidence of intellectual, methodical purpose. I began my measurements, starting low, though even the lowest marking was beyond my comfortable reach, requiring me to stand on the tips of my heavy logging boots. These weren't scrapes left by a foraging animal stretching for sap or marking territory in a rush. These were deep, deliberate scores, horizontal cuts into the wood, blunt on the edges, almost like they were made by a rounded, incredibly dense tool, maybe a fist bone, or a thick, heavy length of broken antler, wielded with focused power. The first distinct line, the most recent, was exactly 7 feet, 3 inches from the soil line. I noted the weathering. The sap was still slightly visible, drying, meaning this mark had been made perhaps within the last 6 months, maybe less. I stepped back, my neck craning. 7 feet, 3 inches. That was the height of the creature's reach. or perhaps the height of its eye level when fully stretched. But then I looked up, and the breath caught in my chest, a cold, painful realization hitting me like a physical blow. The marks did not stop. They ascended the trunk in a horrifying, organized procession. I had to drag the 12-foot ladder out of the back of the pickup, the kind the Forest Service uses for high limb pruning, and set it against the massive trunk. Climbing was slow, methodical, every rustle of the surrounding brush making me freeze and listen, convinced I was being watched, that I was violating some sacred secret chronicle. At the 8-foot mark, there was another score, deeper, older, filled partially with dry lichen, the edges softened by years of rain and sun exposure. I scraped away the growth carefully with my knife tip. It was the same width, the same blunt force signature. Then 9 feet, 1 inch, then 9 feet, 7 inches. The pattern was unmistakable. They were height measurements, growth markers recorded over time. But the precision was unnerving. They weren't chaotic. If you charted the horizontal distance between the scores, there was a steady, if slightly erratic, upward progression. It mapped growth. It mapped development. I spent nearly 4 hours on that tree, meticulously mapping the scores onto my notepad, transferring the exact location and estimated age based on the depth of the weather erosion and the encroaching bark growth. My focus became singular, tunnel-visioned, shutting out the creeping dread that this forest, this beautiful, silent place I had called my refuge for 30 years, was housing something fundamentally alien to our understanding of life. The marks went up to an astounding 11 feet, 4 inches. This score was heavily weathered, nearly swallowed by a deep fissure in the bark, suggesting it was decades old. An old massive creature reaching a height that defied biology as we knew it, had stood here, reached, and recorded itself. But the shocking truth wasn't the maximum height. It was the minimum. I climbed back down, brushing the old bark from my jacket. I moved further down the trunk, scanning the lowest visible marks. The lowest mark I could definitively identify as part of the sequence was situated at 4 feet, 2 inches. It was faint, almost completely overgrown, but distinct under the magnifying glass I carried. I sat on a downed log, pulling out my water bottle, my hands too unsteady to write. I looked at the progression, 4-2, then 4-8, then 5-1, then 5-7, and continuing upward to the colossal 11-4 peak. If this was a family, or even a single individual's self-documentation of growth, what did those lowest numbers represent? A child. A juvenile Bigfoot, standing against the measuring tree, perhaps being guided by an adult hand, just like human children mark their growth on kitchen door frames. The thought chilled me to my core. It wasn't just physical evidence, it was evidence of culture, of conscious effort to track development, of ritualistic behavior passed down. This wasn't a fleeting creature. This was a sedentary, intelligent population with roots deep in these mountains. The sheer expanse of time documented on this trunk started to truly sink in. The lifespan. I knew the rate of growth for this particular species of cedar. I knew how quickly the bark expanded, how long it took for deep wounds to be partially sealed by new growth. Based on the weathering and encapsulation of the lowest marks, I estimated that the time span covered by this growth chart was easily 70, perhaps 80 years. 80 years. If the lowest mark represented a juvenile, say, 5 to 10 years old, comparable to human developmental stages before the growth spurt, and the highest mark represented a fully mature, ancient individual near the end of its natural life cycle, that implied a maximum lifespan that defied standard mammalian biology. If they reach maturity around 20 years, a guess but based on the spacing of the mid-height scores, and the full progression takes 80 years, we are looking at a creature capable of living over 100 years, perhaps significantly longer, maintaining immense size and power for decades. This explained the historical depth of the sightings, the consistency of the reports stretching back to the indigenous populations. These creatures weren't flashes in the pan. They were ancient sentinels, watching the forest change, watching us change across generations. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on me, heavier than the humidity or the solitude. I thought about Sarah, my wife. I thought about the reason I sought refuge in these long, isolating patrols, the guilt of being unable to save our marriage, the hollow silence of our empty home back in the valley. I sought simple, solvable problems, a wildfire, a lost hiker, a downed line. This was not simple. This was existential. I started taking photographs, meticulous cross-references with a scale ruler, ensuring every detail was cataloged. But even as the lens clicked, turning the raw, shocking truth into sterile data, the inherent trauma remained. I was documenting the existence of a civilization. As twilight began to creep through the dense canopy, painting the clearing in bruised purples and deep indigo, I noticed something else near the base of the measuring tree, something I had initially dismissed as root runoff. Tucked into the roots, protected slightly from the weather, was a shallow depression filled with small stones. They were arranged in a near-perfect circle, about the size of a dinner plate. They weren't naturally occurring. They were river stones, smooth and uniform, carried here from the rushing creek nearly a mile away. Layer D, the behavioral signs, was stacking up faster than I could process them. The markings were the chronology. The stone circle was the ritual. I didn't dare touch the stones. This was a boundary, a shrine, a place of significance. It suggested intelligence far beyond tool-making. It suggested spirituality, perhaps a marking of territory, or maybe even a commemorative spot, tied directly to the lineage chronicled on the bark above. Was this where the young stood to be measured? Was this where they left offerings? The forest had gone utterly silent. The typical evening chatter of jays and squirrels had ceased. The wind that usually rustled the high pines had dropped entirely. That heavy, oppressive silence, the kind that makes the hairs on your arms stand up and your ears strain for the slightest crack of a twig, was the creature's most reliable warning. It was the universal signal that something massive, unseen, and highly aware was holding its breath nearby. My instinct screamed at me to pack the camera, get down the ladder, and drive out until the pavement felt safe beneath the tires. But the scientist in me, the broken man who had nothing left to lose but his sanity, compelled me to stay. I needed more data. I needed to understand the spacing between the 4.2 mark and the 11.4 mark. I reached out and lightly traced the oldest scar, the 11.4 mark, feeling the rough edges and the smooth moss coating it. It felt less like a scratch and more like a signature, a deliberate, powerful confirmation of presence. If this documentation started 80 years ago, who made the initial marks? And if these creatures live over a century, how many generations have continued this tradition? Was the individual who made the 7.3 mark related to the one who made the 11.4 mark? Grandfather and grandson? A profound, sickening awe washed over me. I wasn't just looking at evidence of a cryptid. I was looking at a living, breathing, generational document. This tree wasn't just measuring height, it was measuring history, stability, and longevity that proved this species was dominant in this ecosystem long before the first logging truck came through. The feeling of being watched intensified. It was no longer a vague paranoia. It was focused, heavy, like a spotlight shining through the gloom. I could almost feel the heat radiating off a massive body hidden just beyond the reach of my truck's high beams. I realized I hadn't moved from the base of the tree in 5 minutes. I was immobilized by the sheer magnitude of the data and the raw, ancient presence I sensed surrounding it. My focus on the low growth markers, the child's marks, had connected me to this species in a way that footprint casts never could. It humanized them, or perhaps revealed the profound intelligence of their non-humanity. They raised their young, they documented their milestones, and they occupied this land with a patience that dwarfed my short, anxious human life. I whispered, the sound swallowed immediately by the thick air. "What are you doing here? And how long have you been doing it?" The only reply was the low, steady thrumming of my own heart in my ears, accelerating now, forcing me to finally grab my gear. The scientific process was over for the night. The terror was beginning its shift. I packed the tripod, pulled the heavy ladder down with a jarring metallic clatter, and fled the sacred clearing, knowing I would return the next morning, but already certain that the measuring tree held secrets far darker and older than just height progression. It held the secret of their lifespan, and that secret, once fully understood, would break the timeline of human history. I brought the equipment back the next morning. It was a compulsion, a sick necessity. My old self, the one who needed proof, who lived and breathed data, the man who believed the natural world had rules that could be mapped. That part of me demanded I verify what my eyes had seen. The previous day, finding that tree, it had been a blur of shock and adrenaline. Now it was cold, clinical fear. The morning air in the clearing was heavy and still. Not the vibrant, breathing stillness of a healthy forest, but a suffocating absence of sound. Even the normal, incessant rustle of needle litter underfoot seemed muted, like walking on layers of forgotten felt. I carried my heavy-duty backpack, the one usually reserved for multi-day geological surveys, laser measuring devices, specialized calipers, a high-resolution camera rig, and most importantly, a spool of industrial-grade surveyor's tape. The tree stood exactly where I had left it, as if it could have gone anywhere. It was a ponderosa pine, immense, perhaps 300 years old, though its girth suggested an antiquity far beyond its height. The bark was thick, deeply fissured, blackened in places by old, long-forgotten surface fires. And there, ascending its massive trunk, were the marks. I started at the base, where the first indentations were almost obscured by decades of sap run and moss. They were not gashes or claw marks. Those I knew well. Bears scratched to mark territory or to remove parasites. These were specific, deliberate horizontal incisions, shallow V-shapes pressed deeply into the softer wood between the bark ridges. They looked less like vandalism and more like a record etched with meticulous, painstaking effort. My hands were shaking, not violently, but with a fine, internal tremor that made handling the small instruments difficult. I knelt, scraping away the lichen to get a clear measurement of the lowest mark. It sat precisely 3 feet, 1 inch above the mineral soil, a measurement oddly specific, a perfect distance for a very young, relatively short individual to reach. I began the meticulous process of documentation. For hours, I worked in silence. The only sounds the whir of the measuring tape retracting, the click of the camera shutter, and the frantic drumming of my own heart in my ears. I measured the height of every single mark, all 176 of them. Then I measured the vertical distance between each successive mark. I used the laser measure to project a perfectly vertical line up the trunk, ensuring my readings weren't skewed by the tree's slight westward lean. The initial pattern was the first punch to the gut. The distance between the first 20 marks was highly variable, sometimes separated by as little as half an inch, sometimes 3 or 4 inches. This suggested rapid, uneven growth, perhaps over a period of high instability or quick maturation, the accelerated, chaotic growth of youth. The marks themselves at this lower level were shallow, almost tentative, like the work of a child still learning to handle the carving tool. But as I moved up the trunk, the pattern shifted. Around the 50-foot mark, a height that already ruled out any known bear species even when standing fully upright, and certainly any human child, the marks began to stabilize. The intervals tightened and became remarkably consistent. They were spaced almost exactly 75 inches apart, occasionally 2 inches, but the variation was minimal, and the marks themselves grew deeper, wider, more confident. They weren't tentative scratches anymore. They were deep, permanent etchings, carved with enough force to breach the cambium layer. This consistency, spanning hundreds of marks, terrified me more than the sheer height. It suggested regularity. It implied a scheduled return. Whoever or whatever was doing this, it wasn't random. It was a ritual, possibly yearly, possibly seasonal, but adhered to with an unnerving precision that spoke not of instinct but of discipline and planning. I climbed the rest of the way, using climbing spikes and carefully secured ropes, praying I wasn't damaging any critical evidence. As I reached 60 feet, 70 feet, my breath hitched every time I drove a spike into the bark. At the 75-foot mark, a point impossibly high, higher than any standing human can reach even with a 10-foot pole, the individual making the mark was still growing. I tried desperately to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was an elaborate measuring system devised by an old, obsessive prospector, using an extremely long pole and a system of pulleys. But why the specific, almost organic progression of height? Why start at 3 feet and meticulously track growth for decades? Prospectors track gold, not their own height on the side of a massive pine. A cold wave of realization washed over me, despite the physical exertion of the climb. If these marks represented yearly growth, then this creature, or these creatures, lived for an astonishingly long time and reached physical maturity at a size that defied conventional biology. I noted the mark at 77 feet 6 inches. It was the last full, clear mark I found. Above that, there were only faint abrasions, suggesting either a plateau in growth or that the subsequent measuring tool was too short. 77 feet 6 inches. That's nearly 24 meters. No. Wait, I had to correct myself. The mark wasn't where the head reached, it was where the hand reached. If the creature stood on the ground and reached up to make that mark, its actual standing height would be significantly greater, depending on its arm reach. Even assuming a human proportion, say, a reach 20% greater than standing height, the height of the individual making the 77-foot mark was already astronomical. But the data on the tree wasn't measuring the creature's full height. It was measuring reach. I came down from the tree, my arms aching, my mind buzzing with numbers that refused to coalesce into anything rational. I spread out my notes on a makeshift table, the smooth, glacially polished top of a fallen boulder nearby. I had transferred all the data to my field computer: mark number, height above base, interval from previous mark. The first 50 marks showed exponential growth, followed by a dramatic stabilization. The individual grew from 3 feet to perhaps 50 feet in reach relatively quickly, then growth slowed to a crawl. The remaining 126 marks tracked an almost glacial increase in height, barely 2 or 3 feet over what appeared to be decades. The implications were staggering. If these marks were indeed yearly, as the consistent spacing and the biological logic of growth stages suggested, 1. They reached full sexual maturity and maximum height, very late. 2. Their total lifespan must be immense, exceeding anything we ascribe to terrestrial mammals, perhaps rivaling the oldest turtles or even bowhead whales. This wasn't an animal. Animals follow standard growth curves. This was something that maximized its size early to survive predation, then settled into a slow, measured existence defined by immense longevity. The fear in my chest hardened into a chilling, professional curiosity. This tree wasn't just physical evidence. It was a biography, a timeline written in wood, and this biography suggested a being that spent its first several decades achieving monumentality, and then perhaps centuries maintaining it. I looked at the sheer number of marks again, 176. If each mark represented 1 year, the individual responsible for the entire sequence was nearly 200 years old, and perhaps still alive, still visiting this tree. My rational mind, the old biologist fighting for control, scrambled for alternatives. Could wind shear and freezing cycles cause this consistent etching? No, the markings were carved against the grain, clearly showing pressure applied from an external tool. Could it be a fungal infection causing concentric rings of damage? Unlikely, as the shape and consistency of the grooves were too uniform, too designed. I thought of old man Silas, the local elder who ran the small, dilapidated supply post 20 miles down the access road. He had tried to offer me an explanation for the unsettling silence in the valley weeks before, something about the earth breathing slow when the great walkers are near. I had dismissed it as old-world nonsense, the superstitious mumblings of a man who spent too much time alone. But now, staring at 176 carefully placed data points suggesting a life nearly 2 centuries long, I wished I had listened closer. I packed up my specialized equipment, ensuring the SD cards were secure. I had to get this data back to the station. Not to report it, that was impossible, but to analyze it in a controlled environment, away from the oppressive shadow of the forest. The sheer volume of evidence, the undeniable proof of intelligence and longevity etched into that ancient pine, was suffocating. As I took one last lingering photograph of the highest mark, the one at 77.5 feet, I felt the familiar heavy weight of being watched settle on my shoulders. It wasn't the paranoia induced by solitude. It was a profound instinctual knowledge. The silent, empty clearing was not empty at all. I looked around the circumference of the clearing, where the shadows of the surrounding ancient firs were beginning to stretch long in the mid-afternoon sun. The wind was completely absent. The trees were unnaturally motionless. It felt like standing on the stage of a vast, natural amphitheater, waiting for the performance to begin. And I was the only visible audience member. I quickly checked the perimeter for fresh prints, but the ground was too hard and covered in decades of pine needles to reveal anything clear. But the feeling was there, heavy and undeniable. They knew I had found their ledger. They knew I was documenting their history, and they were waiting to see what I would do next. The realization brought a fresh wave of panic, twisting the clinical curiosity into visceral dread. If this creature had lived for a century and a half, its understanding of the forest, of cyclical patterns, of the presence of human interference would be absolute. I wasn't studying a relic. I was violating a sacred space under the gaze of a centenarian intelligence. I imagined the creature, the 176-year-old entity, standing silently among the shadows, watching me measure the evidence of its childhood, its adolescence, its long, slow march toward physical peak. Did it feel pride, annoyance, or perhaps only the cold, distant indifference of a being whose lifespan made my own existence seem like a fleeting spark of static? I grabbed my pack, clipped the carabiner, and started the long walk out of the silent clearing. I didn't run, because instinct told me running would confirm I was prey. I walked with a forced, unnatural slowness, every nerve fiber screaming at me to break into a sprint. My mind was still on the numbers, calculating the possible reach, the arm-to-torso ratio, trying to determine the minimum standing height that could possibly reach 77.5 feet. The math was impossible. The implications were catastrophic for accepted biology. If those marks were yearly, the creature was ancient. If the marks represented some other, slower interval, say, one mark every 5 years, the creature wasn't just ancient, it was practically immortal. That thought stopped me dead in my tracks, just past the edge of the clearing. I couldn't share this data. The sheer antiquity of the timeline would destabilize everything. It wasn't just evidence of an unknown hominid. It was evidence of a hidden civilization of immense longevity, existing in plain sight, maintaining its ancient record on the trunk of a massive pine. The weight of that tree's etched timeline felt heavier than my pack, heavier than the centuries of forest surrounding me. It was a secret I had measured, photographed, and recorded, and now it was mine to carry. A burden of truth that threatened to crush the fragile reality I had inhabited just 2 days prior. I had quantified a myth, and in doing so I had invited the myth's owners to pay attention to me. And I knew, with sickening certainty, that their attention would be terminal. I felt the guilt begin to bloom, the profound, soul-rotting guilt of the trespasser who knows he has seen what was forbidden. I didn't just look at the tree, I cataloged it. I treated it like an archaeological ruin. I spent 3 full days back in that gully, mapping every scratch, every groove, every impossible scrape that reached 12, 13, sometimes 14 feet high, measured precisely from the frozen ground line. The air itself felt thick with ancient dust, though none was visible. It was the dust of time, heavy and stifling, the kind of silence you feel in a crypt when you realize the stones around you predate your language. My background, what was left of it after the divorce and the long, isolated years in the Ranger Service, had trained me in meticulous documentation. I brought in specialized field equipment, dental compound to create casts of the deepest marks, high-resolution cameras, laser measures, and core samples. That was the key, the core samples. A tree, especially one that old, is a living clock. Dendrochronology, the science of dating events and tracking history through tree rings, was something every decent forester lived by. I needed to know 2 things: the age of the ponderosa pine and the precise date each cluster of markings was made. The ponderosa was massive, a survivor, the kind that had been spared by old logging crews because it was too knotty or too difficult to reach. My initial core sample, extracted carefully to minimize damage, screamed an age of at least 400 years, maybe closer to 5. It was a pillar of the forest, a silent witness to everything that had happened in that valley since before the first Europeans mapped the coastline, and the markings were not uniform. If you scrape a young tree, the wound heals quickly, leaving scars that are pushed outward by subsequent growth rings. If you scrape an old tree, the wound takes decades to close, sometimes creating permanent exposed grooves in the thick, corrugated bark. The markings on the Bigfoot measuring tree were layered. I started with the most recent, the freshest, deepest grooves, usually at a height of around 9 to 10 feet. These were made by something immensely strong, capable of tearing away layers of bark and sapwood. By counting the rings that had formed over the exposed wood, I could pin these events down to maybe 10 to 15 years prior, recent enough to feel them breathing down my neck. But as I worked lower, using a scalpel and magnification lens to trace the growth patterns across the ancient bark folds, the timeline began to stretch, horrifyingly. There were marks, shallow, yet clearly intentional, that had almost been fully swallowed by the tree's girth. These were the ghosts in the wood. To date these, I had to understand the tree's specific growth rate over centuries. It wasn't linear. Droughts, fires, and canopy competition all played a role. But I knew the local history. I could cross-reference the rings with known fire years and climate data. And the dates came back, shattering everything I thought I knew about the wilderness. I found clusters of marks, scrapes, gouges, perhaps even bite marks, hard to tell, that dated back over 150 years. These weren't random animal activities. They maintained the same structural patterns as the newer marks: vertical lines, distinct pairs, and groupings centered around specific height bands. This wasn't just a behavior. This was a tradition. A ritual passed down through generations utilizing the same landmark for centuries. But then came the true, unbearable realization. It wasn't just the age of the practice that stunned me. It was the implication for the individuals involved. I had been operating under the assumption that these creatures lived maybe 50 or 60 years, like a large ape or a highly resilient human. But the tree told a different story. A story carved not in wood but in agonizingly slow biological time. The most shocking discovery was a cluster of very small, faint scratches, low on the trunk, maybe 5 or 6 feet high, dating back 210 years. These were clearly the marks of younger, smaller individuals, practicing the ritual, recording their growth. Now track the progression. I found a set of marks clearly made by the same hand, or limb, or paw. I hated using that word, but I had no other. Characterized by a unique scraping pattern, like a slight twist at the end of the gouge. This distinctive signature appeared at the 5-foot height in the 1810s. I tracked that exact signature up the tree. It appeared at 7 feet high in the 1850s. It appeared at 9 feet high in the 1890s. And most incredibly, I found the final highest, most powerfully etched mark with that identical, telltale scraping twist at 12.5 feet, dated to the 1930s. 120 years, documented on a single tree, representing the growth and maturity cycle of a single individual. 120 years. And the mark in the 1930s wasn't a death record. It was a peak measurement. It meant that this creature, this witness to 2 centuries of American history unfolding around its secluded gully, lived to be at least 120 years old, maybe far older, if its measuring practice only began in early adolescence. My hands started to tremble so badly I had to put down the magnifying glass. The cold reality of the calculation slammed into me harder than any physical encounter could have. These were not short-lived, stressed apes fighting for survival. These were beings operating on a geologic timescale, evolving in parallel with humanity, observing us from the shadows of history. They had a maturation rate comparable to that of a giant tortoise or a bowhead whale. The implications were catastrophic for the prevailing scientific model, and even more terrifying for my immediate survival. A creature that lives 150 years develops a memory, a wisdom, and a social structure far beyond anything we associate with wildlife. They remember. They remember the men who logged the forests 50 years ago. They remember the fires 100 years ago. They remember the roots of the original indigenous tribes before the settlers came. The measuring tree wasn't just a record of height. It was a library of generational memory, a silent testament to deep, enduring intelligence. If one individual lived that long, how strong was the social bond? How sophisticated was the transfer of knowledge across such vast stretches of time? I started charting the different signatures, the distinctive patterns of the scrapes, the depth, the angle. I realized I had recorded perhaps 20 different unique individuals over the span of 250 years. 20. In the span of 2.5 centuries, only 20 distinct individuals had participated in this ritual on this one tree. That number spoke volumes about population density and reproductive strategy. They weren't breeding constantly. They were slow to mature, slow to reproduce, and immensely long-lived. They valued stability over proliferation. They were not a species under stress. They were a species that had mastered the art of survival through patience, longevity, and secrecy. They were the ultimate apex predator, not because of immediate brute force, but because they had all the time in the world. My throat tightened. I felt less like a researcher and more like a grave robber, exposing secrets that should have remained buried beneath the moss and the dense canopy. I was peeling back the skin of time itself, and the stench of antiquity was overwhelming. I remembered the old indigenous stories I'd vaguely heard, dismissed as myths, tales of the tall people being the original inhabitants, older than the mountains themselves, watching the flow of human generations like water washing over stone. I had scoffed then. I wasn't scoffing now. I spent the next 2 days trying to find counter-evidence. Could it be a growth anomaly? Could it be a species of bear I was unfamiliar with? I researched every possible explanation, but bears don't leave consistent, chronological, measured marks over 2 centuries on the same precise tree in the same way, progressing vertically with the exact growth speed I calculated. The tree knew what it was. It was a scoreboard for immortal ghosts. I started running scenarios in my head, terrible equations fueled by the adrenaline of intellectual terror. If a creature lives 150 years, its memory of pain, of conflict, of human intrusion also lasts 150 years. They don't forget the great-grandfathers of the loggers currently working 5 miles west. That's why the silence of the woods felt so heavy. It wasn't empty. It was full of history, full of patient waiting. I packed up my core samples and equipment, moving with a reverence I hadn't felt since standing in a church as a child. I covered the tree with camouflage netting and debris, trying to restore its anonymity. This information could not fall into the wrong hands. It couldn't even fall into the right hands, because the right hands would immediately want to hunt what they couldn't understand. The sheer monumental lifespan of these creatures changed the nature of the mystery entirely. This wasn't about finding a rare animal. This was about confronting a living lineage that had outlasted every empire, every civilization we'd ever created. We were the fleeting disturbance. They were the permanence. Driving back to the station, I felt a deep, profound shift. My job as a park ranger suddenly felt minuscule. I wasn't guarding tracts of land. I was trespassing on the ancestral domain of beings that saw human generations as merely a brief, noisy interruption in their long, silent vigil. The terror wasn't that they were animals. The terror was that they were ancient, enduring, intelligent observers, charting their slow, monumental progress against a tree that had stood sentinel for 500 years. And I had just read their ledger, a ledger that implied the creature I was looking for, the creature whose eyes I might one day meet, was potentially older than my great-great-grandfather. It was a cold, paralyzing thought, thick as the winter fog that often rolled through those old-growth valleys. The feeling that every footstep I took, every snap of a twig, was monitored by something that had been watching the world turn since before the Constitution was written. The measuring tree was silent now, but the numbers it yielded screamed one truth into the sterile air of my truck cab. They have time on their side. And time, when dealing with an intelligence this vast and patient, is the ultimate weapon. I had opened the door to deep time, and the cold air of the past rushed out, chilling me to the bone. And the deepest fear was realizing that they knew exactly how long I had left. My own pathetic, short lifespan, and they could afford to wait me out. It's been 40 years since I stepped away from that tree, but the ghost of the sap scent and the cold dread still cling to the collar of my memory. I never found peace again, not after calculating the scale of their time. We think of ourselves as creatures of decades, maybe a century max. We build things that last 300 years and call them ancient. I looked at the numbers I pulled from that grove, and the span of human civilization became nothing more than a few scattered footnotes in a life that stretched back past the melting of the last great ice sheets. If I told you the truth about what the measuring tree revealed about their lifespan, you wouldn't believe me. You can't, because it means rewriting everything you know about biology, evolution, and what it truly means to survive. Before we begin, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. The fear initially was acute, a primal, animal terror of the unseen predator. But the terror that followed, the profound, crippling sense of utter insignificance, was academic. It was the fear of a man who realized the foundations of his world, built on principles of predictable timelines and established biological limits, were completely illusory. I was a man of the Forest Service, a meticulous biologist who tracked the growth rings of ancient ponderosas and correlated wildlife population data with climate shifts. I understood scale. I understood deep time, but only in geological terms, not in the context of a single, sentient being. The notes were scribbled across 3 separate water-stained field journals, filled with sketches of the carving patterns and detailed measurements taken with digital calipers. I had cataloged hundreds of individual marks on that one specific western red cedar. The tree itself was colossal, easily 8 feet in diameter, with bark deeply furrowed and resistant to decay. A perfect historical ledger. I used a simple regression model first, correlating the known average growth rate of juvenile Sasquatch, derived from the distance between the smallest, lowest marks, assuming a standard maturation period similar to higher primates, and then projecting that curve outward. The early data points were surprisingly neat. The marks spaced out relatively consistently up to about the 20-foot mark, aligning with what we might expect for a hominid reaching full adult stature, roughly 12 to 15 years to achieve 70% of maximum height. If they matured similarly to humans, perhaps sexual maturity around 18 to 20 years, with a lifespan ceiling of 100 to 150 years, the marks should have ceased or at least become negligible, around the peak adult height of 8 or 9 feet. But they didn't. They kept going. The marks continued upward, not just minor fractional increases, but distinct separate notches indicating further measurements taken years apart. They climbed past 10 feet, past 12, reaching absurd, unbelievable heights, the highest marks demanding a leap or the use of a tool, suggesting that even these immense creatures continued to grow, or at least be measured, long after what should have been biological senescence. This is where the standard biological models failed. If a creature stops growing vertically around age 25, why is it still being measured at 13 feet 4 inches 30 years later? The only logical, chilling conclusion was that 30 years was nothing to them. I started factoring in a slower metabolic rate, trying to account for the physical size and presumed cold tolerance. I looked at the longevity of turtles, of bowhead whales, creatures that minimize damage through extreme cold or slow internal processes. But those creatures don't actively measure their height on trees. I had to abandon the human primate growth curve. I had to treat the Sasquatch as a biological outlier, a separate branch of the tree of life that had somehow bypassed the standard rules of cellular degradation. I introduced a variable for an extended period of slow growth, an adolescence lasting not decades, but perhaps 2 centuries. The math was conservative, almost timid. I assumed maximum efficiency in their biological processes, minimized their risk of injury, and stretched their reproductive cycles to the absolute breaking point of plausibility. And still, the numbers were terrifying. The cluster of marks below the 15-foot level, the ones that were deepest and most eroded, suggested repeated measurements over a vast stretch of time for individuals who had reached staggering heights. When I cross-referenced the deepest etching patterns, the marks that had clearly been there for centuries, the tree having grown around them in thick layers of bark, with the growth rate of the cedar itself, the true age of the record began to emerge. The tree was approaching a millennium in age. The oldest recorded marks were near the center, where the bark was most protected and hardened. These marks predated the arrival of Europeans on the continent. They were made by individuals who were already fully grown, already reaching 12 or 13 feet. My stomach turned. I wasn't looking at a generational record. I was looking at the life history of individuals. I spent 3 days locked in my cabin, feeding the data into my ancient laptop, running simulation after simulation, trying desperately to find a mistake, a faulty caliper reading, an error in the cedar's dendrochronological mapping. I used every known factor that dictates lifespan: telomere length degradation, hypothetically reversed or dramatically slowed, rate of oxidative stress, mitochondrial efficiency. Everything pointed back to the same impossible truth. The longest-lived individuals recorded on that tree, based on the sheer duration between their earliest and latest marks, appeared to span centuries. Not 150 years, not 250. My most conservative calculation for the individual who made the highest, deepest mark, the one etched with a chilling, almost reverent precision, came back at 800 years. 800 years, within a margin of error of plague 150 years, meaning this being could have been alive during the Crusades. The implications were catastrophic. If they live for centuries, they possess not just memory, but true generational history. They are living libraries. They remember the ancient paths before they were mapped, the rivers before they were dammed, the forests before the lumber companies arrived. They are not merely surviving, they are perpetuating. I tried to fight it with logic, of course. This must be the result of overlapping generations. Perhaps multiple, closely related individuals used the same spot, marking their own height in the exact place the ancestor did. A form of ritualistic continuity. But the precision of the marks, the slight, distinctive differences in the angle and depth of the scoring, suggested otherwise. It was a single hand, or at least a single style, recording a single, continuously measured entity. The official explanation, had I ever dared to report this to the Forest Service, would have been instant and dismissive. Bare claw markings, aggressive rubbing, anomalous tree scarring due to disease or fire. They would have cited the sheer absurdity of the biological time frame. No vertebrate on Earth, outside of deep-sea environments or specific marine mammals, survives for that long while maintaining such high levels of mobility and metabolic activity. But the marks were not random scratches. They were horizontal, deliberate, and situated precisely where a hand or an implement would be used for accurate measurement. I couldn't stay away. The data terrified me, but it also demanded physical confirmation. I had to confront the tree again, not as a scientist measuring data, but as a human trying to grasp the scale of the living history it contained. I returned to the grove late that evening. The sun had long abandoned the deep canyons of the Cascades and a thick wet fog was rolling in, smothering the sound of the nearby stream. The forest floor was silent, carpeted in a thick, insulating layer of pine needles and decay. This was the profound, unnatural silence that always accompanied their presence. A silence born not of absence, but of intense, focused observation. I approached the cedar cautiously, my breath condensing in the cold air, my headlamp cutting a weak, useless beam through the vapor. I didn't bring my calipers this time. I brought only my hand. I placed my palm against the rough, cold bark, letting the texture soak into my skin. It felt like holding the spine of an ancient, petrified book. I traced the paths of the scars. The lower marks, distinct and crisp, represented the young ones, the decades of growth that mirrored my own ephemeral existence. Then I reached higher, stretching to the marks that required a jump or a tool, the ones representing the full adulthood of the species. My fingers found the deepest scar, the one that had yielded the terrifying 800-year estimate. It was at least 12.5 feet off the ground. I had to press myself against the trunk, craning my neck back, the effort forcing a sharp, ragged inhalation. When my fingers finally curled into that deep, hardened groove, a cold, heavy sensation settled in my chest. It wasn't just the cold of the bark, it was the cold of realized time. A creature that lived for 800 years had no concept of urgency. They didn't worry about the next generation the way we do, rushing to pass on knowledge before the inevitable collapse. They were the knowledge. They had seen human tribes rise and fall, adapting to agriculture, then industry, and now, the reckless digital age. All of it, a blink. If they possessed a social structure, it would not be based on the rapid, aggressive struggle for dominance we see in short-lived species. It would be based on deep reverence, immense patience, and an unbroken line of historical continuity. They wouldn't fight over territory for a season, they would manage it for a millennium. Standing there, reaching for the mark of a being that had been alive when my own ancestors were still struggling in mud huts in Europe, I realized the horrifying depth of their intelligence. This longevity implied a capacity for complex long-form memory and strategy that dwarfed human capabilities. They weren't just smarter than us, they were historically smarter. They had seen the consequences of our actions played out hundreds of times over, and that brought the fear full circle. If they exist, and they possess this kind of temporal knowledge, then every encounter, every sighting, every time a hiker goes missing, is not an accident. It is a decision. They are not animals reacting to stimuli. They are agents of geological, historical patience. My heart was pounding a frantic, useless rhythm against my ribs. I felt the overwhelming weight of their collective history pressing down on me. I was standing in their library reading their most sacred text, the measurement of their endless lives. And the reader was being watched. I knew with a certainty that froze the blood in my veins that the profound silence was not because they were far away. The silence was the sound of a very old mind, deciding what to do with the man who had just unveiled the most fundamental secret of their survival. I backed away slowly, my eyes scanning the dense black shadows above the tree line. The fog made the world dimensionless, turning the nearby spruces into shifting black monoliths. I thought of the oldest individual on that tree, the one that measured 13 feet, 4 inches, etched deep into the grain. Was it still out there? Did it remember the feeling of carving that mark centuries ago? If these beings live for centuries, what happens when they decide that the species that lives for 70 years, the one that burns the world down every 20, is no longer sustainable? The confrontation wasn't with a beast. It was with the terrifying realization of my own species' ephemerality. I needed to leave, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the implications of the data. I had unearthed a truth that changed the entire framework of existence. We are not the dominant species. We are merely a rapidly proliferating parasite, observed by creatures whose life cycles laugh at our concept of time. I stared up at the highest mark, feeling the oppressive gaze of unseen eyes. I knew without doubt that I was in the presence of something ancient, something that had learned to survive by simply outliving its threats. And I, the messenger carrying the proof of their infinite timeline, had just become the most significant and perhaps the most transient threat of all. Some things in those woods were never meant for us, but they're still out there, waiting. If this story moved you, consider subscribing. Stay safe out there. The silence that fell around the base of that Douglas fir wasn't the natural quiet of a high mountain forest. It was the silence of judgment. It was the crushing weight of centuries, pressing down on one man who had accidentally read a forbidden diary etched into the wood. My fingers traced the deepest, highest marks one last time. They weren't just scratches. They were signatures, a slow, deliberate charting of existence. The analysis I had feverishly completed, the micro-measurements comparing the intervals to known tree growth rates, the slow accumulation of lichen in the deepest grooves, the simple, horrifying arithmetic, all pointed to an immutable truth. The span of time recorded here was astronomical. The highest marks were fresh, perhaps 2 or 3 generations removed, representing fully mature individuals whose height surpassed 12 feet. But the lowest, weathered almost into invisibility near the roots, were ancient. I knelt, scraping away the clinging moss, finding where the growth began, where the parent had first measured a child. Based on the established dendrochronology of the surrounding stand, the record on that single tree spanned, conservatively, 300 years. 3 centuries. It shattered everything. It meant they weren't a remnant population barely clinging to existence. They weren't a large primate, bound by the 50 or 60-year lifespan of even the largest apes. They were an enduring, immensely patient species, witnessing the rise and fall of colonial empires, the passing of indigenous tribes, the noise of 2 world wars, all from the deep, quiet darkness. They were not animals. They were silent historians, observing us from the fringe. This immense longevity explained the depth of their intelligence, the impossible stealth, the sheer wisdom I had sometimes glimpsed in their fleeting presence. They had time to learn, time to perfect the art of remaining unseen, time to become truly ancient observers of the world. The cold shock of this realization rooted me to the spot. It wasn't just a biological anomaly, it was an existential one. How could a creature with a lifespan rivaling the oldest redwoods survive undetected? Because detection, I realized, was simply beneath them. We were quick, ephemeral, loud, and dangerous. But we faded. They endured. I stood slowly, the air suddenly thick and viscous. The hairs on the back of my neck, having been perpetually raised for the last hour, now lay flat, sensing not danger but presence. An overwhelming organic musk, sharp like ozone and damp earth, saturated the atmosphere. It wasn't a smell of filth. It was the smell of the mountain itself, concentrated and alive. I turned toward the deep timberline, where the light fractured into blinding spears. I didn't see movement, but I saw the absence of movement, a gap in the visual noise. And then I saw the eyes. They were far back in the gloom, 2 dull amber coals that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. They weren't shining with predatory focus. They held the calm, heavy regard of an elder, watching a foolish child fumble with a priceless artifact. The sheer scale of the creature holding those eyes was terrifying. It blended perfectly, yet its outline was undeniable, a mountainous shadow that seemed to exhale the very humidity of the forest. It was taller than the measuring marks suggested, perhaps 13 feet, due to the slight upward slope of the ridge behind it. Its presence didn't just command the space, it seemed to define it. The fear was primal, but beneath it a desperate, irrational reverence bloomed. I was standing before a living embodiment of the measured time on that bark. I was looking into the eyes of a 300-year legacy. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't run. I was immobilized by the immensity of the secret I had just stolen. The creature didn't move a muscle. It simply watched me process the weight of its history. In those deep, intelligent eyes that held no malice, only profound patience, I saw the confirmation of my discovery. Yes, the eyes seemed to convey, we are that old, and this is how we live. It was a silent, mutual understanding. The creature knew I had read its record. It knew I had understood the implication of its existence. The measuring tree wasn't just a height marker. It was a testament, a library of the generations. It had been left where it was perhaps because no human had ever been expected to connect the dots. After what felt like an hour, though it couldn't have been more than 90 seconds, the creature performed a movement so subtle, so fluid for its size, that I almost missed it. Its head tilted a fraction of an inch towards the tree. It was a gesture of ownership, of finality. You have seen enough. Now leave. The spell broke. My lungs seized air, painful and cold. I backed away, slowly, reverently, never turning my back on the massive silhouette. I didn't stumble over roots or snap twigs. Every step was deliberate, an act of obedience. I was retreating from sacred ground. As I finally rounded the outcrop that broke the line of sight, I risked a glance back. The space was empty. The creature had vanished, dissolving back into the light and shadow, leaving only the oppressive ancient silence in its wake. Aftermath and consequences. I don't remember the hike out. I remember the smell of my own sweat and adrenaline mixed with the lingering scent of that heavy musk clinging to my clothes. I reached the truck just before sundown, the forest taking on that aggressive, purple hue where every shadow seems to move. The drive back to the station was a blur of self-recrimination and utter disbelief. I had the data, I had the measurements, the photographic evidence of the markings, and the chilling, definitive conclusion. I had the truth that would rewrite anthropology, evolutionary science, and probably human arrogance itself. And I knew with sickening certainty that I could never ever share it. If I presented this undeniable evidence of a species living for centuries, with the calculated intelligence required to maintain such a record, capable of avoiding us for millennia, the consequences would be catastrophic. The scientific community would demand specimens, the government would unleash extraction teams, the forest would turn into a war zone overnight. They had existed in peace because they were classified as myth, or at worst, a dying, misunderstood animal. This revelation would change them into an invaluable resource, a threat, or both. Their longevity was their greatest secret, their ultimate vulnerability. I pulled into the deserted ranger station lot around midnight. I sat in the cab, the engine ticking as it cooled, staring at the small waterproof journal where I had transcribed the final calculations. My hands, still trembling slightly, reached for the cigarette lighter. The act was painful. It felt like tearing up the Constitution. But the fire was the only purification, the only guaranteed silence. I systematically tore out the pages containing the measurement matrix, the calculations for the growth rate of the fur, and the resulting timeframes. One by one, I held them to the flame, watching the ink bubble and blacken, the horrifying numbers curling into ash. The photographic film, the physical proof, had to go too. The images were beautiful, sharp, and damning. I didn't risk burning the entire roll. I just exposed it completely to the harsh overhead light of the station porch, scrambling the delicate, latent images into an unusable milky white. When I was done, only smoke and a profound emptiness remained. I had erased the greatest discovery of my life, thereby ensuring the survival of something far greater than my career or my reputation. I resigned 3 weeks later. I cited stress, burnout, and an urgent need to reconnect with family, none of which were true. The truth was, I couldn't look at a stand of trees without seeing the silent, enduring watchers behind them. I couldn't listen to the wind without hearing the ancient breathing of the mountain. The knowledge corroded me from the inside out. I had seen time defined in bark, and I knew that my own 70 or 80-year span was nothing more than a fleeting pulse in the existence of the Sasquatch. I had witnessed the face of deep history, and it had left me scarred and utterly isolated. The guilt wasn't for lying to the world. The guilt was for the brief moment of arrogance when I thought I had the right to read their secrets. Epilogue. Decades later. It's been 54 years since I drove away from the Cascades for the last time. My hair is white, my hands shake now with age, not adrenaline. I live in a quiet, manicured suburb where the only wildlife is an occasional stray cat or overly bold squirrel. The air is filtered, the noise is manufactured, and the silence is hollow. But the silence I remember, that dense, heavy, ancient silence of the great forests, that's the silence that haunts me. I never spoke of the measuring tree. I kept the secret buried deep, a lead weight tethered to my soul. I became adept at lying by omission, at politely changing the subject when conservation or ecology came up. I watched the endless parade of blurry videos and excited theories on the internet with a wry, painful amusement. They search for a missing link, a primitive ape. They have no idea they are looking for the oldest civilization on the continent, a people whose history spans beyond written records, whose wisdom is etched into the very foundations of the earth. Sometimes, late at night when the house is still and the streetlights cast sickly orange squares on the bedroom wall, I can still feel the weight of those amber eyes. They weren't judging me. They were simply knowing me. They knew I would measure and calculate. They knew I would understand the implication of 3 centuries recorded in vertical growth. And they knew, perhaps even expected, that I would ultimately choose silence over catastrophe. I often wonder if the record still grows. Is the current patriarch, the one whose outline towered over me, still adding marks for his grandchildren? Does the sap rise on that tree, fueling the silent library, documenting a history we are too fleeting to comprehend? I sold my land. I left the mountains, but the mountains never left me. They gave me a truth too heavy to carry, a responsibility I never asked for, and the lonely distinction of knowing that we are not alone, and perhaps we are not even the primary inhabitants of this world. The terrifying realization, the final sharp nail in the coffin of my understanding is this: their longevity means they have seen human beings come and go, rise and fall, countless times. We are a passing storm to them. They have the time to wait us out. They always have. I confess this now into this recording device because the time for complete silence is drawing to a close for me. Let the words be carried on the electronic wind, indistinguishable from the noise of the internet. Maybe they will sound like fiction. Maybe they will be dismissed as the ramblings of an old man. But the truth is preserved, not in the bark of a tree anymore, but in the tremor of my voice. Some things in those woods were never meant for us. They exist on a timescale we cannot fathom, protecting their ancient lineage with a patience we cannot match. But they're still out there, in the deepest, quietest dark, waiting, measuring. If this story moved you, if the weight of this ancient secret resonated even a little, consider subscribing. Stay safe out there, and pay attention to the silence. Sometimes it's watching you.